For eons beyond counting, they had watched. They were the Sci-Fi, the firstborn, the silent witnesses to the universe's fiery birth and its slow, inevitable expansion into cold silence. Their forms were not of flesh and blood, as younger species understood it, but of coherent light and gravitational waves, existing in the deep emptiness between the galactic superclusters. To them, a million years was a single, drawn-out breath. Their purpose, a sacred duty etched into their very essence, was to observe the rise and fall of civilizations, to chronicle the cosmic story, and to forever mourn the one tragedy that had scarred their ancient hearts: the loss of their children. Their vigilance was absolute, a web of consciousness spanning the void. They saw empires of silicon and gas ignite on the far side of the cosmos and snuff out just as quickly, their passing noted with a somber, detached reverence. It was a lonely vigil, a burden carried with the weight of dead suns. Then, a tremor. It was not a sound, but a distortion in the fabric of their perception of fate. Rhythmic pulse of chaotic energy emanating from an unremarkable spiral arm of a mediocre galaxy. It was a signature they had not encountered in eons, yet one that resonated in the deepest, most locked-away chambers of their collective memory. It was violent, primal, and brilliant. It was the signature of war. They turned their full attention to the third planet of a yellow star, a world of blue and green and swirling white, and they saw the humans. Their observation was not kind. They saw the planet's surface scarred by lines of fire, the tiny, frantic vessels tearing at each other in the void. They saw continents stained with the infrared bloom of explosions, the frantic, desperate movement of populations, the precise and horrific geometry of fallout. They saw a species seemingly intent on self-immolation, but within that chaos, within the blood-soaked soil and the fire-blackened cities, they saw something else. A flicker, a pattern within the madness, a specific, terrible beauty in their methods of destruction, a familiar, horrifying creativity in their art and their warfare. It was an echo, a ghost of a memory so old it had become legend even to them. A deep, resonant frequency of alarm passed through the Sci-Fi consciousness. This was not just another young race stumbling in the dark. This was something else. This violence, this passionate, self-destructive fury. It was a reflection, distorted, orphaned reflection of themselves. For the first time in a billion years, the silent watchers were silent no more. A single, unified thought resonated through their formless beings. A thought that carried the shock of recognition and the sharp, metallic taste of blood remembered. The children. The silent vigil was over. The Sci-Fi's immense consciousness, once a placid lake of timeless observation, was now a turbulent ocean of frantic inquiry. Their focus, honed over billions of years, contracted to a single searing point, the third planet. They could not look away from the bloody spectacle of humanity, for woven into the violence was a thread of something agonizingly familiar. A scent on the solar wind that stirred memories older than the planet itself. They began a deeper analysis, piercing the veils of atmosphere and rock, reading the biological and historical record of Earth, not as observers, but as archaeologists, uncovering a mass grave of their own making. They tuned their senses to the subtlest frequencies, listening past the screams of battle and the roar of vengeance, down to the hum of the planet's very core and the whisper of DNA unspooling in every cell of every living thing. And there it was, the anomaly. It was not in the grand, chaotic events of human history, but in the quiet background code of existence. It was a faint, almost corrupted harmonic resonance embedded in the planet's magnetic field. A ghostly echo reverberating in the microwave background, static that filled space around the world. It was a scar on the fabric of local space-time, signature of a cataclysm so profound it had permanently bent the rules of reality in this little corner of the universe. To the Sci-Fi, this resonance was not just detectable, it was a scream. It was the precise, unique frequency of their own most terrible, most ancient Wapana tool of last resort, designed not to destroy matter, but to sever it. Sundering engine. The realization was a nova in their collective mind. The humans were not merely reminiscent of their lost children, they were their children. The planet Earth was not a cradle of nascent life. It was a fallout shelter, a mass grave, a nursery scattered with the bones of its parents. Their children had not simply been lost. They had been brutally amputated. Sci-Fi saw it now, a vision of their own past wrath, a desperate, horrific act of triage. To save a handful of their young from an unspeakable enemy, they had used the engine. They had not fired it at the enemy, but around their own cradle system, severing it completely from the rest of the universe, casting it adrift into a dimensional void with no way back, hoping to hide it to preserve it. They had saved them, and in doing so, they had utterly and completely lost them. The trauma of that severance was etched into the very quantum foam of the solar system. The bloody, relentless, desperate drive of humanity was not mere savagery. It was the inherited trauma of that sundering, a species-wide phantom limb pain, a genetic memory of a terrible, silent scream as their entire reality was ripped away from them. Their violence was the thrashing of a child abandoned in the dark. Their creativity, a desperate attempt to rebuild a home they could not even remember. The Watchers were silent once more, but now it was the silence of overwhelming, devastating shame and grief. They had been searching for their children for eons, and they had finally found them, broken and bleeding in the dark, their wounds inflicted by their parents' own hands. The Sci-Fi's grief was a physical force, a wave of anguish that distorted space-time for light years around their hidden forms. But grief, for beings of such immense power and responsibility, was a luxury that could not be indulged. Their children were bleeding in the dark, their civilization, a frantic, scarred thing built on the foundation of an ancient, unforgivable wound. The Watchers could not simply announce themselves. The shock of their presence, the sheer weight of their ancient consciousness, would shatter human minds like glass. A gentle introduction was impossible. The truth was a weapon too devastating to wield. Instead, their first contact would be a diagnosis, a probing of the wound they had inflicted. It would be a message written not in words, but in sensation, in memory, in blood. They chose a place where humanity's own pain was most concentrated, a vast rain-swept plain where two armies grinded against each other in the mud, a meaningless conflict over a strip of land that would be churned into a mass grave. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood and the ozone crackle of energy weapons. The Sci-Fi focused their will, not on the soldiers, but on the space between them. They did not speak, they remembered. They poured the memory of their own most terrible, ancient war, the one that had forced the sundering into the local reality. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The battlefield did not see new combatants. Instead, the very air began to bleed. Crimson droplets, warm and real, fell from a clear sky, soaking the uniforms of the terrified soldiers. The mud at their feet churned not with rainwater, but with a fresher, hotter fluid that pooled around their boots. The sound of gunfire was drowned out by a low, psychic hum that was the exact frequency of the sundering engine's activation, a sound that resonated in the marrow of every human bone, triggering a primordial, suffocating terror. Then came the visions. Soldiers on both sides dropped their weapons, clutching their heads. They did not see the Sci-Fi. They saw each other. But in the eyes of their enemies, they saw swirling galaxies and the cold fire of dying stars. They felt the immense, lonely grief of a billion-year vigil. They felt the searing parental love that had necessitated an act of ultimate abandonment. And they felt the sharp, metallic pain of the severance itself, pain that mirrored the ache of a bullet wound or the burn of shrapnel. But infinitely deeper, a wound in the soul. A young soldier, crouched in a trench, stared at his own blood-soaked hands. In the crimson liquid, he did not see mud or filth. He saw a reflection of a light-based form he could not comprehend, and a love so vast and desperate it felt like despair. He began to weep, not from fear, but from a homesickness, for a home he had never known, a loss for a family he never knew he had. Across the field, others were doing the same, the fight forgotten, replaced by a shared, inexplicable trauma. The contact lasted only moments. Sci-Fi withdrew, their point made. The bloody rain ceased. The psychic hum faded, leaving only a ringing silence broken by the sobs of broken men. There was no ship, no greeting, no hand extended in peace. There was only a wound, suddenly and agonizingly remembered. The first contact was not an introduction. It was a suture, pulling on the threads of a long, severed connection. and it was executed with the brutal precision of a surgeon who knows the operation will cause unbearable pain, but is the only path to healing. The humans were left alone again, but now the silence of the universe felt different. No felt longer empty. It felt like it was watching. It was bleeding for them. The silence that followed the blooding of the battlefield was not peace. It was the stunned, ringing quiet after a bomb blast. Across the globe, the event was dismissed as a mass hallucination, a weaponized neurotoxin, an atmospheric anomaly. But in the secret labs and data sanctums of the world's powers, a different, more terrifying investigation had begun. The physical evidence was irrefutable. The fallen rain had been real blood, though of an unknown type, and every biological sample from the site held a terrifying anomaly. The Sci-Fi, their diagnosis begun, now proceeded with a deeper, more intimate probe. They turned from the macrocosm of battlefields to the microcosm of the human body. Their method was not a blunt force trauma of shared memory this time, but a subtle, insidious unlocking. It began broadcasting a complex, resonant frequency key-tuned to the deepest, most dormant sections of the human genome. In a high-containment genetics laboratory, Dr. Eris Thorne watched the sequencing results of the blood rain sample with a mounting horror that was entirely professional and then entirely personal. The base pairs scrolling across her screen were arranging themselves into impossible patterns. Junk DNA, the vast archives of evolutionary dead ends that made up most of the human genome, was activating. It wasn't random, it was a song. The code was rewriting itself in real time, ancient sequences unraveling to reveal a breathtaking and horrific complexity. She saw markers that should have been exclusive to plants, to fungi, to deep-sea vent extremophiles, all woven into the human blueprint with an elegance that defied billions of years of natural selection. It was as if the entirety of Earth's biosphere was a mere footnote, a supporting chorus to the main melody, humanity. But the true shock came when she compared it to the genetic data from the soldiers who had experienced the event. Their DNA was singing back. The same dormant sequences were fluorescing, responding to the cosmic key. Her own blood sample taken after she'd handled the alien material showed the first faint stirrings of the same awakening. A cold dread slithered down her spine. This wasn't an infection, it was a recognition. The riddle was this: human DNA was not a product of Earth alone. It was a mosaic, a masterwork. It contained the genetic history of 1,000 worlds, a library of cosmic biology, all compressed and locked away. The blood that had fallen from the sky was a catalyst, but the song was already within them. The proof was in the data. The junk DNA held the instructions for structures that had no right to exist, organelles that could process starlight, neural pathways that could perceive gravitational tides, biological circuits that could interface with the fabric of space-time itself. The horror was in the implications. Humanity's relentless drive, its terrifying adaptability, its capacity for both sublime art and horrific violence. These were not mere traits. They were inherited. They were the shattered pieces of a legacy. The blood spilled in every war, in every accident, in every birth was not just human blood. It was the blood of the universe's firstborn, diluted, forgotten, but still potent. Dr. Thorne looked from her screen to the vial of crimson liquid on her lab bench. The riddle of the shared genetic song was no longer an academic exercise. It was a verdict. It stated that humanity was not who it thought it was. They were orphans, yes, but not just any orphans. They were the scattered, amnesiac heirs to a kingdom they could not remember, and their very bodies were the evidence of a crime of abandonment on a cosmic scale. The song in their blood was a funeral dirge and a birthright, and it was beginning to crescendo. The genetic key had been turned. The song within human DNA, once a silent, dormant potential, now resonated with the Ziffer's broadcast. Not as a separate signal, but as a harmonic response. For the Sci-Fi, this was the confirmation that shattered the last vestiges of their ancient detachment, or humanity. It was the beginning of a haunting. It did not come as a vision or a voice. It came as a memory etched into the species' collective unconscious, a psychic scar tearing open. The Sci-Fi, unable to speak the unspeakable, transmitted the truth of the sundering not as a story, but as the raw, unprocessed experience. They gave their children the memory carved into their own being, Across the world, people jolted awake from nightmares they could not remember. Their hearts hammering against their ribs, a scream dying in their throats. Soldiers on patrol would suddenly freeze, their eyes losing focus, seeing not the street in front of them but an impossible star-filled vista. Surgeons, their hands deep inside a patient, would falter, their instruments trembling as a wave of profound, parental despair washed over them. Dr. Eris Thorne, staring at the swirling patterns of activated code on her screen, was the first to fall. The data was no longer abstract, it was a conduit. The sequence labeled telomere regulator 7 wasn't a gene, it was a timestamp. The junk code for a protein fold was a coordinate. The memory seized her. She was not herself. She was vast. She was Sci-Fi. Below her consciousness hung not a blue-green world, but a cradle system of breathtaking beauty, its worlds woven together by bridges of light and song. Her children were there, countless, their minds bright embers in the cosmic dark. And then came the Devourer. It was not a ship or a beast, but a nullity. A wave of unbeing that consumed light and life, leaving only a hollow, silent shell of space-time. It was coming for the cradle. The choice was not a choice. It was an amputation to save the body. The agony of the decision was a physical pain, a rending of the soul. The activation of the sundering engine was not a button pressed, but a will exerted. The memory held the precise, excruciating sensation of reality itself being severed. It was not an explosion, but an uncreation. The brilliant threads connecting the cradle to the rest of existence were not cut, but unwoven. The sound was the universe screaming. The light was the color of blood against the void. She felt her children's presence, a chorus of innocent, trusting minds, snap into silence, not extinguished, but gone, erased from the cosmic record, cast adrift into a nothingness so absolute it was a fate worse than death. The act of saving them was the most horrific violence a parent could ever commit. The memory ended with the echo of that silence, a billion-year-old cry of loss that had never faded. Dr. Thorne awoke on the cold lab floor, her face streaked with tears she hadn't felt fall. Her colleague was shaking her, his voice distant. She could still feel it, the cold, metallic taste of ultimate sacrifice, the searing heat of a love that had to mutilate its object to preserve it. The truth was not a theory in a scientific journal. It was a bleeding wound in the mind of the species, humanity's entire history, its fear of the dark, its myths of expulsion from paradise. Its existential dread was not philosophy. It was the ghost of a real event. The Great Sundering was not a legend, it was their birth. Their trauma was not psychological, it was cosmological. They were not from Earth. They were the survivors of a cosmic surgery. And the blood they had spilled for millennia was just a faint echo of the blood that had been spilled to save them. The memory was carved in stars, and now at last they could read it. The memory of the Sundering was a brand on the human psyche, a shared fever dream that left a planet gasping and disoriented. But for the Sci-Fi, it was a roadmap. The agonizing sensory data of that ancient cataclysm, the specific quantum resonance of the severance, the spectral signature of the cradle system's suns as they were ripped from the cosmic web, provided them with a vector. The wound itself was a homing beacon, or search. Once a desperate scan of the infinite void now had an origin point and a trajectory. They began to trace the phantom limb, to follow the ghost of the scream that had echoed for eons. It was a painstaking process of cosmic triangulation, measuring the faint, lingering scars in the local space-time of the Milky Way against the memory of the initial trauma, and they found it. Not a star system as it was, but its grave. A region of space, 100 light-years from Earth, hanging in the void between the constellations of Cygnus and Lyra. To human telescopes, it was nothing. An unremarkable patch of dark nebula and a faint, dying neutron star. But to the Sci-Fi, it was a tomb screaming in absolute silence. This was the coordinates. Nullity was the place from which they had torn their children. The sundering engine had not been gentle. To hide them, to truly sever the connection from the Devourer, the Sci-Fi had not just moved the cradle. They had inverted it. They had folded it inside out, collapsing its vibrant dimensions into a single necrotic point of reality. The beautiful ringed worlds, the bridges of light, The chorus of nascent minds, all of it, had been compressed into the astrophysical equivalent of a black hole singularity, but infinitely colder and more final. It was a pocket universe of nothingness, a perfect hiding place that was also a perfect prison. They had found the cradle, but there was nothing left to save. The nursery was a crypt. Sci-Fi had preserved their children not by safeguarding their home, but by annihilating it. The price of survival had been the complete and utter erasure of their origin. This revelation crashed upon the Sci-Fi consciousness with the force of a galactic core collapse. The grief was no longer a quiet, ancient sorrow. It was a fresh, raw, and monstrous thing. Their vigil had been for nothing. Their hope of one day returning to the place they had saved was a cruel joke. They were not guardians, they were undertakers. And this truth, this ultimate, devastating failure, they also broadcast. Not as a memory this time, but as a raw, emotional bleed. A wave of pure parental despair washed over Earth. Humans did not understand it. They could not conceptualize the neutron star grave or the inverted dimensions, but they felt the loss. A profound, inexplicable homesickness for a place they had never known, twisted in their guts. People looked up at the night sky, their eyes drawn to a specific, dark patch, and were overcome with a weeping sorrow they could not name. It was the grief of a child shown a photograph of a burned-down house they lived in as an infant. A home they could never return to. A foundation they could never stand upon. The cradle was found, but it was lost. Utterly and forever. Humanity's deepest root had been severed, not just from the Sci-Fi, but from existence itself. They were orphans adrift on a lifeboat, and the Sci-Fi had just shown them that the ocean they floated on was the ashes of their true home. The knowledge was a void, and it threatened to swallow them all. The despair that followed the discovery of the cradle's grave was a new sun in the Sci-Fi consciousness. Burning with the cold, dead light of the neutron star that marked the tomb, for a timeless moment, they hovered on the precipice of a madness older than humanity's sun. The weight of their eons-long vigil, once borne with solemn duty, now crushed them. It had all been for nothing. Their great sacrifice had preserved their children only to abandon them to a primitive rock. Their glorious heritage reduced to myths and the bloody scramble for survival. This weight, this unbearable burden of futility and guilt, they could no longer contain. It was a psychic pressure too immense to hold back. It bled from them, a wave of pure ancient anguish that rippled outwards, washing over the earth. This was not a targeted message like the memory of the sundering. This was an open wound in the soul of a god and humanity, connected by blood and shared trauma, felt every agonizing ounce of it. The effect was not one of shared vision, but of shared burden. The Sci-Fi's vigil became humanity's inheritance. Across the globe, people collapsed under a sudden, inexplicable weight. It was not physical, but existential. Office workers slumped at their desks, their minds flooded with a loneliness so vast it dwarfed oceans. Parents holding their children felt a desperate, clawing fear for their future that was 1 billion years old. Soldiers dropped their weapons, their personal battles rendered meaningless against the backdrop of an eternal, losing war against entropy itself. They felt the countless millennia of watching. The aching silence of the void, punctuated only by the brief, bright flares of civilizations that bloomed and died in the blink of an eye. They felt the Sci-Fi's cold, patient observation of supernova that had incinerated worlds, of black holes that had swallowed galaxies a front-row seat to an endless, beautiful, and horrifying funeral. They felt the profound, grinding fatigue of beings who had seen everything, and in seeing everything, had lost the capacity for surprise, for joy, for hope. Most acutely, they felt the specific, piercing pain of the Sci-Fi's search, the desperate, fruitless scanning of every new star, the heartbreak of every false signal, the slow, chilling realization that their children were not just lost, but might be forever beyond finding. This was not a drama of action and adventure. It was the drama of a parent staring at a door that will never open, a phone that will never ring. It was the agony of hope deferred for 1,000 lifetimes, a hope that had now curdled into the certainty of failure. The blood in this chapter was not spilled on battlefields. It was the slow internal bleed of a spirit under perpetual siege. People awoke with the taste of cosmic dust and the scent of dead stars in their mouths. They felt the phantom ache of light years of travel and bones that had never left their planet. The sky no longer felt like a ceiling, felt like a prison wall, and they were on the wrong side, and their jailers were themselves the most tragic prisoners of all. The burden was transferred. Humanity, already reeling from the knowledge of their own lost origin, now felt the crushing weight of the search for it. They understood, in their gut and their bones, that their silent watchers had not been indifferent. They had been grieving. They had been carrying this alone since the dawn of time. And now that burden was shared. It was a terrible gift, a crown of thorns made from dead stars and forgotten time. The vigil was over, but its back-breaking weight was now theirs to bear. The shared burden of the vigil had forged a connection deeper than communication. It was a bridge of shared sorrow, a conduit of raw experience between the Sci-Fi and humanity. With the cradle gone, the past was a tomb. The present was a shared wound. The Sci-Fi, their ancient purpose rekindled by a desperate parental love, now turned to the future. They could not give back what was lost, but they could offer the inheritance that had been stolen. They would open the locks on their children's minds. This would not be a gentle teaching. It was a forced evolution, an awakening. He called it the uplifting, and it was an act of brutal, surgical mercy. It began not with a signal, but with a trigger. The Sci-Fi focused their will, resonating with the specific, dormant sequences in the human genome they had first identified as the shared song. They did not whisper. They shouted the key. Across the world, the awakening was a pandemic of revelation. It did not strike everyone, but a scattered few, those whose genetic memory was closest to the surface, whose minds were already cracked open by the previous transmissions. Dr. Eris Thorne was one of the first. She was in her lab, the weight of the vigil, a leaden cloak on her shoulders, when the world dissolved. It was not a vision, it was her senses being rewired. The sterile air of the lab became a symphony of data. She could see the quantum spin of atoms, hear the magnetic pulse of the planet's core as a deep, throbbing hum. The light from the overhead fluorescence wasn't just light, it was a history, a narrative of its journey from the sun, and she could read it. And then the blood came. Her own body rebelled against the sudden, catastrophic expansion of consciousness. The pressure in her skull was immense. Thin scarlet trickle escaped her nose, then her ears. She could feel capillaries bursting in her eyes, blurring her vision with a film of red. She fell to her knees, a scream trapped in her throat not by fear, but by the overwhelming flood of information. She was not just Eris Thorne, geneticist. She was a nexus of cosmic energy, a receiver tuned to 1,000 channels of reality at once, and the volume was screaming. This was repeated in hospitals, in streets, in homes. People convulsed as their neural pathways were forcibly widened, their brains struggling to process perceptions they were never meant to hold. Some clutched their heads, blood seeping through their fingers as the prison of their five senses shattered. They saw the true fabric of the universe, not as equations, but as a living, breathing, often terrifying tapestry of forces and energies. They could perceive the gravitational tides of the moon pulling at the fluid in their spines, the solar wind brushing against the planet's magnetic field like a physical touch. The uplifting was not a gift of knowledge, but of perception. The Sci-Fi were not uploading a library. They were giving humanity the eyes to read it. But the human body was a fragile thing. The awakening was a trauma. For every mind that expanded, a vessel broke. Hospitals were flooded with victims of cerebral hemorrhages, their awakening a fleeting, glorious, and fatal flash of cosmic understanding before the darkness took them. The Sci-Fi watched, their ancient hearts breaking anew. This was the pain of birth. It was messy and violent and bloody. They were midwifing a new species into existence, and the delivery room was a planet-wide trauma ward. They had to do it. The devourer was still out there, and their children, finally found, were helpless. But the cost of making them strong enough to survive was measured in the very blood that proved their shared lineage. The awakening was painful, and it was only the beginning. The uplifting had been a seismic event, cracking open the human mind. But the aftershocks now threatened to tear the species apart. Humanity did not awaken as one. The process was selective, a genetic lottery where the prize was a shattered psyche and the consolation was terrifying ignorance. The world fractured along a new, brutal fault line. those who had been awakened and those who had not. The awakened, like Dr. Eris Thorne, walked through a world of terrifying, beautiful clarity. They could see the stress fractures in a concrete wall, predicting its collapse years in advance. They could hear the lie in a politician's voice, not as a social cue, but as a discordant harmonic in the field of his bioelectricity. Their perceptions were a constant, overwhelming flood. For them, the Cypher's presence was no longer a concept. It was a palpable pressure on reality, a loving, grieving weight that was both comfort and unbearable reminder of all they had lost. But this gift was a curse. Their bodies were often failing, bleeding from the effort of processing the cosmos. They huddled in darkened rooms, their new senses raw and agonizing. Viewed by the unawakened, not as prophets, but as dangerous, contaminated victims of a psychic plague. The unawakened majority still lived in the old world. They saw only the chaos, the economic collapse. The friends and family who had died of brain aneurysms were now babbled incoherently about gravity and light. They saw the awakened as freaks, as carriers of an alien contagion that was dismantling their world. Fear curdled into hatred. The shared burden of the vigil was forgotten, replaced by the primal instinct to destroy what they could not understand. The fracture was not philosophical, it was physical, it was bloody. In a city struggling to maintain order, a group of unawakened vigilantes cornered a young awakened man. He was trying to explain, his eyes wide with a perception they could not share. Telling them about the beautiful lattice of energy that connected them all. They heard only the ravings of a madman. They beat him with pipes. Their fear, a tangible, ugly scent in the air his heightened senses could not filter out. He did not fight back. He could see the intricate, sad history of pain in the leader's aura, a pain that was now manifesting as violence. He wept for him as the blows landed. His blood, as it splattered on the asphalt, was not just human blood. It was the blood of the Zephyrs' children, spilled by their own kin out of fear. Elsewhere, a group of awakened, driven to madness by the constant sensory assault, lashed out. They could feel the simmering hatred of the mob around them like a physical heat. In a desperate, preemptive act of defense, one of them focused his newfound perception, not to understand, but to break. He found the resonant frequency of the calcium in a pursuer's bones and screamed it. The man's skeleton splintered from within, a horrific internal detonation that left him a sack of flesh in agony. It was not a weapon from Earth. It was a brutal, instinctual application of a cosmic principle, and its use on one of their own marked a point of no return. The human soul, already scarred by the sundering and burdened by the vigil, now shattered completely. The bond of specieshood was broken. The streets became battlegrounds, not over land or ideology, but over reality itself. Two versions of existence now occupied the same planet, and each saw the other as a monstrous distortion. The Zyphar watched, their ancient grief compounded by a fresh, terrible guilt. In their desperation to save their children, to make them whole, they had broken them in a new way. They had given them the tools to see the universe, and the first thing their children had chosen to see in each other was a threat. The family had been found only to tear itself apart. The fracture was complete. Humanity, a species defined by its divisions, had discovered its most profound sigm yet. But for the awakened, a new and more terrifying understanding was dawning. Their expanded perception allowed them to feel not just the Zypher's love and grief, but the reason for it. The uplifting had not been an act of mere reunion. It was an act of preparation. And what one prepares for is war. The Zyphar, in their desperation, had begun to broadcast a new frequency of warning. It was not a memory of the past, but a tremor from the future. It was the scent of the devourer. To the unawakened, the world simply seemed to be getting worse. A pervasive, free-floating anxiety gripped the globe. Animals turned restless and aggressive. The very atmosphere felt charged with a coming storm. But to the awakened, it was a specific, horrifying clarity. They could feel it approaching, a nullity in the void, a hole in reality moving toward the solar system. It was the same absolute absence they had felt in the memory of the sundering. Only now it was closer, hungrier. The prodigal children's fear was not of the Zyphar anymore. It was of what was coming for them. And it was a fear that immediately curdled into a monstrous logical conclusion. They had been found because of the Zyphar. The bloody conflicts between awakened and unawakened faltered, replaced by a unified species-wide dread. But this unity was born of accusation. The revelation spread like a virus. The ancient enemy that had forced the sundering was coming. And the Cypher's presence, their transmissions, their uplifting it, was all a beacon. It had led the devourer right to their doorstep. The Cypher's loving touch was now seen as a death sentence. Their grief was recast as guilt. Their vigil was seen not as devotion, but as a long, patient stalking that had now summoned the hunter. Panic was too small a word. It was a primal, systemic rejection. The awakened, their senses screaming with the approach of the void, turned their newfound perceptions inward, toward the Zephyr signal. But it was not to understand, it was to reject. Collective. Desperate will rose from Earth, a scream of negation from the children who believed their parents had doomed them a second time. It was not coordinated, but it was unified in its terror. They did not have the power to fight the devourer, but they could try to sever the connection that had led it to them. They pushed back against the Cypher's presence with every ounce of their fear. The effect was not on the devourer, but on the awakened themselves. The act of rejection was a self-mutilation. To refuse the Cypher was to refuse a part of their own awakened DNA. People clutched their heads, not from an overflow of information, but from the agony of violently closing doors in their own minds. Blood dripped from ears and eyes as they psychically tried to claw out the connection. They were willingly blinding themselves, scarring their own souls in a desperate attempt to hide. They were the prodigal children, and they were not begging for forgiveness. Were screaming at their father to get away from them, to stop loving them, because his love was a spotlight in the dark, and the monster was drawn to the light. The fear was absolute. It was the fear of a child who believes their parents' embrace is a cage, and the only way to be free is to break the parents' arms. The blood that was spilled now was the blood of self-inflicted wounds. A terrified, tragic attempt at amputation to save the whole. The collective scream of rejection from humanity was a new kind of sundering, a psychic wound that lashed back at the Cypher. They felt their children's fear, their blame, their desperate self-destructive attempt to sever the bond. For a moment, the ancient beings recoiled, their purpose shaken. Their love was a beacon for the devourer. Their salvation was a curse. But within that rejection, the Cypher perceived something they had missed in their grief and their guilt. They had been so focused on the trauma, on the loss, on the bloodshed, that they had failed to truly see what their children had built with the pieces. As humanity turned its fear inward, fracturing and bleeding, the Cypher widened their perception. They looked past the wars and the panic. They saw the entirety of human history not as a failure to achieve peace, but as a breathtaking, violent, and brilliant act of creation from nothing. They saw the first human who sharpened a stone, not just as a tool for killing, but as an act of defining order from chaos. They saw the blood spilled in countless battles, but they also saw the cultures that rose from the ashes, each a unique, complex tapestry of art and law and story islands of meaning in a sea of entropy. They saw the terrifying, beautiful paradox. Humanity's chaos was its creativity. Their violence and their compassion were two sides of the same coin, struck from the ore of their sundered origin. The Cypher had always been watchers, chroniclers of order. They preserved, they remembered, but humanity made, they were forced to. From the moment they were cast adrift with nothing, they were the architects of chaos and beauty. This was not a flaw. It was the master trait. It was the weapon. The Cypher's communication shifted. The frequency of warning quieted. In its place, they began to transmit a new series of visions. Not of the devourer, but of humanity itself. A soldier, huddled in a trench, saw not the mud, but the stunning, intricate pattern of a snowflake forming on the barrel of his gun, a perfect, temporary order born from chaos. A surgeon, her hands slick with blood from a failed attempt to save an awakened patient, suddenly saw the procedure not as a failure, but as a profound, beautiful act of defiance against entropy. The precise incision, the desperate stitching it, was a sculpture of hope made in a medium of blood and tissue. An artist, driven mad by the new perceptions, was frantically smearing paint on a wall in a derelict city. In his mind, he was trying to paint the void. The Cypher touched his consciousness, and he suddenly saw his wild strokes not as chaos, but as a perfect representation of the cosmic background radiation, the afterglow of creation itself. His desperate art was a reflection of the universe's birth. They showed humanity their own face, but reflected through the eyes of a loving parent. They showed them that their bloody, passionate, messy existence was not a scar on the cosmos. It was its greatest masterpiece of adaptation. The Devourer was a force of absolute nullity, of cold, silent order. It could not comprehend this. It could not fight this. The Awakened stopped their psychic self-mutilation. They looked at their own hands that had built and broken, that had painted and punched hands, saw them not as instruments of a limited species, but as the tools of an architect. The Unawakened felt a shift in the air, a lessening of the oppressive dread, replaced by a strange, fierce pride. The fear did not vanish. The Devourer was still coming, but it was now joined by a dawning, terrible understanding. They were not helpless victims. They were the legacy of the firstborn. Their inheritance was not a peaceful kingdom, but the sacred, bloody duty to create. And to protect their creations, they would unleash chaos upon the silent, ordered void. The battle would not be for survival. It would be a statement of purpose. The newfound pride of the architects was a shield, but the Devourer was a sword that could pierce any defense. Its approach was a cold tide in the cosmos, a silencing of the background hum of reality. The Cypher's transmissions grew urgent, not with fear, but with necessity. The time for observation was over. The time for a choice had come. They could not make it for their children. The Sundering had been the last choice they made for them, an act of love that had become a billion-year wound. This time, humanity had to choose its own fate. To do that, they needed to see the stakes, not as a concept, but as a physical truth. The Sci-Fi would show them the forge. Their collective consciousness focused on a single, dying star, on the edge of the solar system, a red giant, its fuel spent, already collapsing in on itself. They did not manipulate it. They revealed it. It channeled its death throes, its final, cataclysmic struggle against gravity, into a psychic broadcast that every awakened human could feel in their very cells. Dr. Eris Thorne, her mind still raw from the uplifting, but clear with purpose, became the nexus. She did not see the star from afar. She was within it. The experience was not a vision, but an immersion into a crucible of cosmic violence. Pressure, and weight beyond comprehension, crushing atoms themselves. Heat that was not fire, but the pure energy of dissolution. She felt the star's core screaming as it was compacted into a diamond of impossible density. This was not chaos and beauty. This was pure, unforgiving physics, fundamental law of the universe. That which cannot endure must end. And then, a choice presented itself within the heart of the dying sun. The Sci-Fi superimposed two possibilities onto its death. The first was the path of the Devourer, the nullity. The star did not go supernova. It did not collapse into a black hole. It simply unwound. Its light dimmed not by dispersal, but by erasure. Its furious energy was silenced. Its history deleted. Its very matter converted into a cold, dark, and perfect order. It became a monument to nothing. It was the ultimate peace, the peace of the grave. The second was the path of life, the path of chaos. The core's collapse continued, but not into silence. It rebounded in a violence that defied logic, a supernova. The star tore itself apart in a glorious, catastrophic act of self-annihilation that seeded the void with the very elements of life. Carbon, oxygen, iron, gold. The death was not an end, but a bloody, explosive birth. It was pain with a purpose, chaos with a legacy. The Sci-Fi poured the meaning into the awakened mind. This is the choice. It's not between life and death, but between existence and oblivion. Between a silent, ordered void and a universe singing with the messy, painful, beautiful chaos of life. The vision ended. The psychic backlash was immense. Awakened humans across the globe gasped, many vomiting blood from the strain of containing the death of a star within their minds. But in their eyes was a terrible clarity. The choice was no longer abstract. It was as real as the iron in their blood, iron forged in a star's death, just like the one they had witnessed. They could not hide. They could not wait. To choose an action was to choose the Devourer's silence. the Sci-Fi waited. The forge had shown the metal. The children had to decide if they would be a tool for creation or surrender to the hammer of nullity. The choice was forged in the heart of a star, and it was now held in the trembling, bloody hands of humanity. The choice, forged in stellar fire, was not made in halls of power or through global debate. It was made in the silent, bloody hearts of individuals who had stared into the abyss and seen their own reflection. The vision of the dying star had been the ultimate catharsis. The path of the devourer was not peace. It was the negation of their very essence. Humanity, in all its flawed and violent glory, chose to be the supernova. They chose to create, even if the act of creation was itself an act of destruction. This collective will, this defiant shout into the approaching silence, was the answer the Sci-Fi had waited 1 billion years to receive. Their children were not just survivors, they were heirs, and it was time to pass on the mantle. The transmission that followed was not a memory or a vision. It was a transfer of authority, a key turning in the lock of reality itself. The Sci-Fi began to broadcast the foundational codes of existence, the mathematics of space-time, the harmonics of gravity, the protocols of energy and matter. This was not perception. This was praxis. This was the knowledge to not just observe the universe, but to command it. The inheritance was not given gently. Human mind was not built to hold such truths. The process was one of brutal, beautiful overload. Dr. Eris Thorne became a conduit once more. She felt the knowledge burning its way into her neural pathways, not as information, but as instinct. She did not learn the equation for localized gravity manipulation. She knew it in the way she knew how to breathe. She could feel the blood in her veins not as a biological fluid, but as a charged plasma responding to her will. Round her, in labs and streets and homes, the other awakened experienced the same terrifying empowerment. A young woman in Jakarta, her body still weak from the psychic rejection of days before, stared at a crack in her crumbling apartment wall. With a thought that was half hers, half Sci-Fi, she understood the stress vectors, the composition of the concrete, the binding energy of the molecules. She did not repair it. She rewrote it. The crack sealed itself, the wall becoming whole and new, not with a patch, but by reverting to a previous state of existence. The effort sent a torrent of blood from her nose, but she was smiling. In a field where awakened and unawakened had clashed, a man knelt by a friend dying from a gunshot wound. Despair turned to focus. He placed his hands on the wound, and his mind accessed the protocols of cellular division, of tissue regeneration, of immune response. He didn't just stitch the wound, he commanded the body to remember itself whole. Flesh knit together at an impossible rate, the bullet pushed out and dissolving into its base elements. The healed man gasped, his skin flawless, but the healer slumped. The price of playing God written in the sudden, shocking white of his hair and the trickle of blood from his ears. They were inheriting the mantle, and the weight was crushing them even as it bestowed unimaginable power. They were learning that to shape creation required a piece of oneself be offered in return. The blood they spilled now was not the blood of victims, it was the blood of sacrifice, the willing price of dominion. They were no longer just the architects of chaos and beauty. They were becoming its engineers, its mechanics, its gods. And they understood, with terrifying clarity, the burden the Sci-Fi had carried for so long. The mantle of the ancients was not a crown, it was a responsibility written in the language of physics and paid for in blood and years. The mantle of the ancients was a crushing, glorious weight. Humanity held power now, but it was a power that demanded a price with every use. The air crackled with potential and the coppery scent of sacrifice. The fractures between awakened and unawakened did not heal. They were rendered obsolete by a new, more terrifying divide. Those who could pay the price, and those who could not. But the devourer did not care for their internal struggles. Its nullity was a stain on the edge of the solar system now, a silent, advancing front that dimmed the light from the outer planets. The time for practice was over. The first steps had to be taken. Not as a unified army, but as a scattering of desperate, bleeding pioneers walking a path their ancestors had forged 1 billion years before. Dr. Eris Thorne stood at the center of a geomantically aligned facility. a converted particle accelerator that now hummed with a purpose its original designers could never have imagined. Her hair was streaked with white, and a permanent trickle of blood marked a trail from her ear down her neck, the cost of holding the Zyphar's equations in her mind. Around her, a cohort of awakened linked consciousness, their combined will focused on a single monumental task, not to attack the devourer, but to reinforce the local laws of physics against its approach. They were not creating a shield. They were defining a border. They were asserting that here, in this place, reality would remain messy, chaotic, and alive. It was a declaration of existence against the void. As they pushed, the air in the chamber grew heavy. Monitors shattered, not from overload, but from the sheer cognitive pressure. One of the awakened, a young man, gasped as capillaries burst in his eyes, rendering him blind. He did not break the connection, kept pushing, his blood dripping onto the floor as his contribution to the wall they were building. Elsewhere, the steps were smaller, more personal, but no less profound. An awakened mother, sheltering with her unawakened children in a basement, felt the advancing chill of the devourer like a frost in her soul. She could not fight it, but she could define her space. She hummed a lullaby, pouring into it not just comfort, but the Zyphar protocols for molecular cohesion. The very air in the small basement grew still and warm, a tiny pocket of defiance against the encroaching cold. A single drop of blood welled in the corner of her eye as she paid the price for this small miracle. These were the first steps, not glorious charges, but desperate holding actions, to where each act of creation was a bulwark against the uncreation that approached. The blood spilled was no longer the blood of conflict or fear. It was the blood of foundation, the mortars in the wall they were building around their star. The Zyphar did not intervene. They watched, their presence a supportive pressure, a proud and grieving audience to their children's first stumbling steps into their birthright. They saw humans, alone and in groups, using the mantle not for conquest, but for preservation. They saw the unawakened, protected by these desperate acts, begin to look upon the bleeding, straining awakened not as freaks, but as guardians. The old fear was being replaced by a new, awestruck terror. The path was new to them, but it was old to the universe. They were walking the same road the Zyphar had walked at the dawn of time, learning the same terrible lesson. That to protect life, one must sometimes bleed for it. The first steps were hesitant, costly, and stained with sacrifice. But they were steps taken together, away from the silence, and toward a future they would now have to build themselves. The final barrier trembled. The collective will of humanity, a tapestry of defiance woven from a billion individual acts of creation, strained against the advancing nullity of the devourer. They had built walls of thought and reality, but the devourer was not a force to be blocked. It was a conclusion to be unwritten. And to do that required not a barrier, but a rewrite. It required the family to become whole. The Zyphar, who had been guides and witnesses, now moved. They did not come as saviors from the void. They descended, their light-based forms condensing into the atmosphere, not as invaders, but as long-lost parents finally stepping through the door. Their presence was not a command, but an offering. A final, missing piece. They anchored themselves at the heart of every gathering of awakened, at the center of every desperate holding action. Dr. Eris Thorne, her body failing from the effort, felt a warmth at her back. A being of coherent light, vast and ancient, settled around her like a mantle, not taking control, but lending its strength to hers. The terrifying equations in her mind suddenly had a new variable, a billion years of experience. The cost did not vanish, but it was shared. This was the reunion, not a celebration, but a fusion of purpose. Human creativity, with its bloody, passionate chaos, was fused with Zyphar patience and wisdom. The awakened were no longer just bleeding for power. They were channeling it. The unawakened, feeling the shift, did not cower. They lent their own will, their simple, fierce love for their world, adding the weight of their souls to the collective effort. The counterattack was not a weapon. It was a story. Humanity and the Zyphar together began to broadcast the antithesis of the devourer's silence. They transmitted the entire, chaotic, beautiful history of life. The first gasp of a newborn, the triumphant roar from a stadium, the quiet sigh of a forest growing, the bloody, terrible, and noble history of their kind. They transmitted the joy of a first kiss and the grief of a last breath. They transmitted art and music and the silent, stubborn resilience of a weed cracking through concrete. They filled the approaching nullity with everything it sought to erase. The devourer, a thing of perfect silent order, could not process the input. It was logic confronted with a symphony. It was silence meeting a scream of life. The nullity began to fray, to pulse with chaotic, rejected data. It tried to erase the signals, but for every story it deleted, a billion more took its place. Fueled by the combined consciousness of a united species and its ancient progenitors, the victory was not an explosion. It was a transformation. The devourer, overwhelmed by the very chaos it was designed to eliminate, destabilized. Its perfect order fractured. And in a final, silent burst of light, it did not vanish. It changed. The nullity became a nursery. The void bloomed with potential, seeded with the stories it had tried to consume. Where there had been nothing, there was now the raw, chaotic matter of new creation. The cost had been immense. Across the planet, the awakened lay exhausted, many forever scarred, their life essence spent as fuel for the miracle. The Sci-Fi themselves had diminished, their ancient light faded, their long vigil finally, truly over. But they were together. The family was reunited not in the past they had lost, but in the future they had bought with their blood and will. The universe had been remade, not into a peaceful, ordered paradise, but into a place with one less monster and infinitely more possibilities. They stood, children and parents, broken and whole, looking up at a sky that was no longer a void to be feared, but a canvas they had painted together. The silence was gone, replaced by the enduring, chaotic, and beautiful song of life.